Hey, what's up guys, it's Matt with the Movement System. In this video, we're going to talk about muscle length tension relationship. So we're going to focus on active tension, and we'll talk a little bit about passive tension as well. And at the end of the video, we'll actually talk about how this exercise physiology concept actually relates to practical training decisions that you might make with joint angles and how that impacts active insufficiency. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Alright, so to give you guys the best idea of how this works in research and then moves into textbooks and then moves all the way to the practical takeaways, we're going to use two main graphs here. One of them is straight from a research study and it's not as well refined, but this is how the data actually looks whenever you're doing research. And then we're going to move to the next graph, which is a little bit nicer looking, and this one's from the CSCS book, the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning book. And this will give you a better idea of the physiology of what's going on and how it might look in a nice picture. So let's start here. Now, what we're going to see here is actin and myosin. So if you're not familiar with the muscle physiology here, basically myosin and actin are two proteins, and when they interact, they form cross bridges. The myosin interacts with the actin, and it can shorten the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the functional unit of muscle. It's very, very small. We're talking about microscopic here in this picture. So from one Z line to the next, that green length there, that's going to be one sarcomere's length. From Z disc to Z disc, or Z line to Z line, however you want to call that. Now you can see there's three levels to this picture. At the very top, we have the resting sarcomere length. Now, this is a little bit confusing when we try to apply this to real life. For example, the bicep muscle, there's no specific joint angle that resting is defined as for every joint. So resting for a hip muscle versus an arm muscle versus an abdominal muscle are all going to be different. So there's no specific joint angle identified here, but we just call this resting length. So the way that resting length is actually defined is by the fact that it is the optimal length. It's the optimal length for overlap for the most interaction of actin to myosin filaments, the potential for the greatest number of cross-bridge formation, and therefore the potential for the highest force output. So when we say force, we're talking about a muscle action. It could be shortening, it could be lengthening, but to make this practical and to apply it to the architecture of the body, we actually have to think about it as torque, which is rotational force, or force applied at a certain distance to cause a rotation at a joint. Now this is really how muscles actually work, and when we think about this optimal overlap, we can think about a corresponding joint angle. For example, for the bicep, it's going to be somewhere around a 90-degree angle. That's going to be optimal overlap, where we're not too shortened, where we're not too lengthened, and we can actually produce a lot of force through the bicep and a lot of torque. So what you can see in that second picture is that's overshortened. And this second picture is not an optimal length tension relationship. This is suboptimal because the actin filaments have actually begun to overlap here. The myosin hasn't overlapped, but there's less ability for that myosin to interact with the actin because of the actin overlap. Again, actin being those green filaments, whereas myosin is that red filament right in the middle of that sarcomere. So if we use the bicep as an example here, this is as we get towards the top of the motion, it's overshortened, and we're running into the problem of active insufficiency here. So as the muscle is too short, there's too much overlap, and we can't create as much force as we could at that optimal resting length. And then moving to that third picture, you can see this is a stretched position. So moving back to the bicep example, you can see that this would be like a lengthened position where the arm is not at a 90-degree angle, but at a greater than 90-degree angle here. And in that case of stretched muscle position, there's less actin and myosin overlap, but it's because that sarcomere is stretched out. The Z discs are farther apart, there's less actin and myosin overlap in the center. This again is a suboptimal length tension relationship. We can't produce as much force, and we definitely can't produce as much torque in this position compared to a resting length. Now I want to mention that the optimal overlap, or that optimal length tension relationship in a resting position, is really a muscle physiology concept. That has to do with the amount of force that a muscle can produce. This does not always align with the optimal joint angle to produce force. So the biomechanics can actually be in contradiction with the muscle physiology mechanics, meaning that the optimal joint angle to produce force biomechanically is not always the same as the optimal or resting angle of the muscle physiology. Now, if that's confusing, we're going to try to make this a little bit more practical at the end of the video. And I did want to pull one quote from the CSCS book, and that is that exercise technique can affect the resistive torque patterns during an exercise and can shift stress among muscle groups. So what that basically means is that during a deadlift or during a squat or during hinge versus squat exercises, we can shift the load and therefore change the muscle activation patterns and the efficiency of different muscles working. So for example, a high bar squat is going to work a little bit more of the quads, whereas a low bar squat is going to work a little bit more of the lower back extensors, just because the lever arm from the back to the barbell is going to be a little bit longer in a low bar squat, whereas that arm is going to be decreased in a high bar squat, and the lever arm of the quadricep is going to be increased in a high bar squat. So changing load and exercise technique can really affect the biomechanics of the exercise and what's going on at the individual muscle level. And to understand this further, we really need to dive into the actual research study, and this is a picture from an actual research study. This study was done on rabbits, and animal studies are really common in muscle research, and that helps inform our understanding of muscle physiology. So what you can see here, and I want to focus on the top picture, is that peak of the active component of the length-tension relationship. So this is talking about as a muscle either shortens or lengthens, how much active force can we produce in that muscle? And this isn't quite as clear as like an exact bell curve, but it pretty much demonstrates that relationship where as you get closer to resting length being 0 at the very top of that curve, you can see that the force production is the highest. And then as we either shorten on one side or lengthen on the other side, the amount of active force that we can generate decreases. And again, I want to emphasize that these data points are from actual observations and measurements, and this is what informs the nicer looking graphs that you'll see in textbooks and things like that. And then towards the right side of these curves, what you'll see is a different dotted line that's going up as the muscle lengthens. And this is actually the passive component of the length-tension relationship, which is also really important to understand. So while the active amount of tension that we can create decreases with increased muscle length, we actually see an increase in the passive amount of tension that we can create. And this can be beneficial for different reasons. In exercises like an RDL, where you're putting yourself into a stretch position, this can have some implications. So in real life, we actually have a combination of active and passive force that's going to produce movement. And based on different athlete goals, we can make a shift between the two. All right, so now let's use a basic example of how we might apply this length-tension relationship to exercise selection. So what you can see here is a picture of myself in a quadruped position here with either an extended leg or a bent knee. And let's say that we want to preferentially load the glute muscles. And maybe if we were just thinking from a biomechanical lens, we could use a long lever with the leg extended, and that would theoretically increase the load on the glute because the leg is longer and that would be more tension. But what we can see now is that we can't look purely from a biomechanical perspective here because of the interaction of the hamstring and the glute muscles. So in the bottom picture where the knee is bent, what we're doing is we're putting the hamstring muscle in a shortened position. So the length tension of that hamstring muscle is going to over-shortened. So the hamstring muscle in the bottom of these two pictures can't produce a lot of force. What does that mean? That means that the glute muscle is going to have to do a little bit more of the workload of producing hip extension. So in the top picture, even though the lever is a little bit longer, there may be a little bit more load, it's going to be distributed between the glute and the hamstring muscle, and we're not going to preferentially overload the glutes. Whereas in the bottom picture with the bent knee, we're putting the knee into a flexion that's going to put the hamstring into active insufficiency, and that's going to preferentially load the glute muscles because the glute muscles are going to be in closer to an active state and contribute the majority of that hip extension force. Some things you may see from an exercise technique perspective, someone may actually cheat this movement by arching the lower back. So if we're using the lower back to create extension, we're taking load off of the glute muscles here. And in a different situation, we may actually want to train the hamstring. So we may actually choose a long lever bridge variation. For example, I'll do long lever glute bridges to focus on the medial hamstring because it translates really well to runners. So basically there's cases where we can combine our knowledge of biomechanics, combine our knowledge of length-tension relationship, and make the most optimal decision on joint angles and body position for different athlete needs. If you want to become an expert about this, I would definitely consider studying for the CSCS exam with the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning book. If you're using videos like this and you are studying for the CSCS exam, it might be worth your time to check out my strength conditioning study course. It includes tons of videos just like this, but a little bit more in depth and focused chapter by chapter to guide you all the way through the Essentials book. This is kind of what it looks like from the inside. It guides you chapter by chapter through the book with in-depth videos, quizzes to check your knowledge, and a nice structure to stay focused all the way through your prep and studying until you can pass. It's helped hundreds of people pass, so if you want to learn more about it, check out the link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.